Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Yes. Welcome to this session on financing for resilience, overcoming hurdles to catalyze regional and locally led adaptation and loss and damage finance. We started this COP with some good momentum on resilience, especially on the loss and damage, the limits of adaptation, by operationalizing this loss and damage fund and capitalizing that fund with more than almost $700 million, with the biggest also replenishment of the GCF, $12.5 billion. But, like Nelson Mandela said, I have walked that long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter. I have made missteps along the way, but I have discovered the secrets that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. I have taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I have come. But I can only rest for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not ended. I'm saying that because there is no complacency. The text that has been adopted is not perfect. It's not perfect. There's been some rambling around it, but it's a significant and unprecedented step forward. But the adaptation side of things is quite left orphan. We only heard a few dozens of millions of pledges. There's even some backsliding on adaptation based on the latest UNEP GAP report on adaptation. And what we heard very loud and clear from developing countries is that they ask for a minimum of 100 billion per year for the loss and damage fund. And we know that what is actually needed, if we keep 1.5 alive, is between 300 and 600 billion per year. So there's still a long way to go. And the global stocktake, the response to the global stocktake that is happening at this COP, will be tough to navigate, but we'll need to create hope with those signals. As Winston Churchill said, there is no time to ease or comfort. It is time to dare and endure. And I have an excellent panel to do that, but there's one person missing. Actually, maybe not missing, he's here with us. And you may have heard some whisper of him. It's Professor Salim Hoque, and he was our grantee from ICAD. And nobody can really be in a climate conference and negotiation without thinking of him, because he was really a father of every effort, especially when it comes to locally led adaptation, to community empowerment on resilience. He was also not only a negotiator, a visionary and mentor, and I would say an avenger of climate justice, inspiring all of us. And it didn't rest with him, because he also created networks of universities for least developed countries, and really forged what we know as the capacity building mechanism under the Paris Agreement. So his legacy is going, further. He's going ahead. It's continuing with us. And I just wanted to bring his spirit to really guide us for this conversation. So now, with no further ado, because we don't have a lot of time, I think I have that excellent panel to really share that spirit of endurance. And I have Ambassador Seyni Nafo, who has been really keeping the torch, the stamina to really mobilize finance for the African Adaptation Initiative for some time. We have daring proposals and pilots from the V20, who has been transforming, and we still transforming, the fate of 1.5 billion of people in 68 countries. And we will learn more about that with Mrs. Sarah Jane Ahmed. We will learn about innovative climate SDG debt swap initiative towards supporting debt relief and improving climate finance in middle-income countries in the Arab region with Dr. Rola Dashti. And we will get some foresight and unwavering determination for our youth to keep hope for the future, Joshua Amponsem, and leveraging impact investments. I learned so much since I joined the Open Society to see how to, from grant to impact investment, we can leverage more and impact more with Georgia, Keene, Levenson. So the panel will highlight various mobilization tools that can foster collaboration between governments and NGOs, the private sector and communities, as essential for mobilizing finance for effective adaptation. We have only 1 hour to do that today, and I would like, without further ado, to start with Sarah Jane. Sara, in your role as V20 Global Lead, among other things, you make the case for financing at the ready as a key component of ensuring resilience. Could you explain what that means? And with all the effort that the V20 is doing with trigger-based mechanism, with cooperating with G7 countries, what are the major hurdles? Why do we do that? What are the major hurdles? What does it matter for actually development? And how you're addressing those hurdles?
Thank you, Yamide, and hello, everyone. So just to step back a bit before going into triggers, I think the issue really is with these funds, it's very difficult to access, and there's a lot of burden on the most vulnerable people and the most vulnerable governments. And so what we're trying to do is loss and damage is not like an adaptation project, nor it is like a renewable energy project. It's a loss that's sustained, and it impacts the system, it impacts community level, their livelihoods, their health systems, their schools, all of this is impacted. And so to draft up a proposal and then submit it and then wait for financing to come is just not conducive to dealing with loss and damage. So how do we do that? How do we then deal with this? And this is where the triggers come in, because we do have cyclone speeds, we have flood data, we have all of this. So there is a way to design triggers so that resources can then be made available. And now the question is, okay, then where will it go? And so this is where the expenditure lines are critical, and to give communities and countries agency to determine what they think is most important in the face of increasing disasters. And so that's really the push for having trigger-based resources, so you could have predictability and you know when it's going to come because XYZ has happened. So I think I know we're short on time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And we are going to go actually regionally to look at the regional picture a little bit with Dr. Dashti. I'm going to ask you, given the social and economic inequality linked to climate change, what kind of stakeholder collaboration, underpinning, what Sara said, and broader tools to really reduce debt and create more resilience among communities?
Thank you. I come from United Nations Regional Economic and Social Commission for Arab countries, Western Asia. And one of our strengths is our convening power. And our convening power is with various stakeholders, whether it was the private sector, member states, or civil societies as we go along. So let me champion, I just finished with one of the sessions, and we have done it with the private sector and with the UN climate change high-level champions, where we brought on projects that needs financing. And with the high-level climate change champions and the GFANs, they brought the private sector. We brought the need of the governments, member states, of important projects to get finance, and we do the matching of it. And so to identify sources of financing and support on making these projects more sellable, de-risking these projects and helping them. So this matching, this convening power is important. The second part is very important, which is adaptation is extremely important in our region. More than 2/3 of the fresh water that is consumed in the region crosses more than one political boundary. So conflict prevention is extremely important, not only, and bringing up innovative regional initiatives on water issues is very important. So we and the World Bank, we're convening and we're bringing member states from various countries, from Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, to come and convene and to, yes, they know the issue because we have upstream countries and downstream countries. So they speak, and we're trying to figure out with them an important regional water initiatives to address these challenges, to make it win-win situation where the World Bank also can become a partner of supporting the initiatives. Another part of we're embarking on, and thanks for with the also support of the OSF partnership, is in the innovative instruments and financial instruments. The current instruments that are available for debt financing and project financing is not working properly also. We need to create also to ease the burden on the fiscal burden for member states. Are we coming up with a debt swap? You just mentioned about it, a debt swap 2.0 we call it. It's not the original debt swap for as initiative instruments. We're working also on supporting member states as well as on the sovereign link, sustainability linked bonds with the credit enhancement guarantees. And this is extremely, and thanks for the effort of all of us that have been pushing the issue of debt, that we have, now they signed the adopting of the task force for the sustainability linked bonds with the credit enhancements, which we need to move forward on the implementation side. But this is the voice what we all after as we go along. And the third part is very important that we launch as also stakeholder is the capacity building. Capacity building and the assisting of the member states, the government institution, public civil service on these innovative instruments. They're still on the traditional way of financing, and which they need to uplift their capabilities to understand when we talk about SLBs, when we talk about debt swaps, when we talk about credit enhancement guarantees, how can they use them to optimize on the utilization and to benefit for them so that they lower their cost of financing as well as they have longer maturity. So capacity building also, we convene on this, and peer-to-peer. What we're doing also with other regional commissions, which is in ACLAC and ECA, we're bringing also best practices and getting the peer-to-peer South-to-South cooperation and bringing this knowledge also as we go forward. Thank you very much.
And from you and from Sara, you know, you already heard a number of mechanisms that are used for both adaptation and loss and damage, mechanisms that are linked to what we hear, you know, at the IMF, you know, some of those, the trigger-based mechanisms or debt swap, you know, mechanism. We try to unpack them, but it just shows how, I think the point is that it really have an impact on people's life. Ultimately, it's try to be very innovative in creating room for a system that has not delivered so far. And I would like to get to you, Ambassador Nafo, to tell us, you know, when after so many years of, you never despaired, you never, you know, gave up in mobilizing support for the African Adaptation Initiative. But it took some time, you know, to do that and to understand why locally led empowerment, how important this is. And I would like you to tell us a little bit why locally led adaptation is so crucial. You've been doing that with some pilot projects like Ecoverse. How you can, you know, tell the story of, you know, how it is actually changing life and how those pilots can be replicated to really transform, you know, a region, a country, and then a region.
Thank you, Yamide, and good afternoon, evening, friends. The first point, I think, adaptation is local context specific. This process of ours has been dealing with mitigation for 30 years. And the two are, as much as they're two sides of the same coin, they're very different in nature somehow. Meaning you can approach mitigation or reducing emission from a very top-down manner. So you can plan, mobilize, almost execute from very far a mitigation action. Adaptation, because of the local context specificity, you need to engage in a bottom-up manner. You need to engage with the local, the national, and the regional. And the reality is that our architecture, the 30 years that we've built out, at least, whether in climate or in development in general, is not an architecture which deals very well with bottom-up. You see? And I'm not going to name any institution, but it starts from very far. You are let's say you are in a capital, you receive instruction from very far, and down. It's very top, bottom. Whereas in adaptation, it has to be the other way around. The impacts are very local, so ideally, it's at the local level that you should understand. You should have the knowledge to understand, and they should have the knowledge to design. But the system is not built like that. The system doesn't empower the local, let alone the national or the regional. So that is maybe the biggest challenge that we have, is that the system that we have right now doesn't empower. And so we need to sort of disrupt that very system. And,
so how do you do it?
How do you do it? Is you take matter into your own hands. Local communities have to do it. Subnationals have to do it. And this is why at the AAI, the job that we have been given by African heads of state is to coordinate the subnationals, to coordinate the civil society, to coordinate, so that at least from the continent that you can. So there's that element of how do you empower in a meaningful manner those who are on the front line. And it's not a given. That's a big challenge. And then the second is that you in terms of the gaps, the capacity which are there, the largest one is how do you even formulate a plan or a project? All those funds you're talking about, I'm not going to be talking about the gap that there is, the funding gap. Some of us have realized, and we have accepted that there will always be a degree of magnitude difference between the needs and what's there. So I've done that for a number of years. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to lament about the fact that you only have 10% of what's there or what's needed. But the point is, even that 10% of what's there, how do you ensure that local, national, regional institutions access that? And not that all of that is accessed by 70%, more than 80% of that is accessed and disbursed by international entities. And to do that, you need to work with the local, national stakeholders in building the capacity to formulate, so to translate science into policy, into action, to blend all kinds of resources, domestic, international, public, private, and then to execute and be able to execute and report per whatever funder reporting template. That's easily said than done, but that's the kind of job that we are addressing at the and implementing.
Thank you. I think you echoed also what Dr. Dashti had said about that capacity building and that convening empowerment, level that is so important. And now I think all of these, I think you mentioned the access, Seyni, and part of the access, and I think the bet that we did at OSF is testing different financial tools. So trying to get our grant that could be a little bit, more flexible and getting there, and also see if we could, mobilize some impact investments on top of, using those debt swap, mechanisms. And when it comes to impact investment, then it comes to private sector, how to mobilize them. And Georgia, you are our CEO of the Impact Investment Fund for OSF, the SEDF, and I would like you to maybe tell us, what would be the stakes and what would be really useful, and the challenges and how important it is to connect those dots.
Thank you, Yamide, and I will do my best to explain, I think, the role of private capital. But before I do, I just wanted to say thank you, really, to everyone here, everyone on this panel. This is my first COP. I came to learn, I came to listen. I've already made a lot of rookie mistakes, but I will just say the privilege and the pleasure and the opportunity to listen and learn with a panel of this caliber is really terrific. Go down the line, but thank you all, and particularly Yamide, thank you. You've been a leader, not just at OSF, but in this field for many years now on a number of issues, but really, I think, helped to put loss and damage on the radar, and the success a few days ago, I think, was in no small part to your leadership. So I really just want to acknowledge that. I think everyone in this room could acknowledge that, but it's it's a really big deal.
Together.
And but learned a lot from you about climate resilience and human resilience. A little bit about impact investing. Ambassador Nafo, you may have come to terms with the finance gap and the funding gap, but I'm gonna at least say that I think there might be a role for catalytic impact capital to unlock a little bit more. It's not going to be enough, but I do think that there are opportunities to say we're 100 billion or a couple hundred billion short per year for adaptation finance. And most of the adaptation finance that has been unlocked, as all of you know, is going to wealthy countries anyway. And I think the important point, at least from my perspective, when it comes to impact investing, is almost all of that is our public dollars. So we really have not begun to tap the private markets. There have been commitments by donor countries to double adaptation finance. We're not even close. So any way you cut it, the investment community has to step up. And I know we talk a lot about the returns that investors are seeking. Investors, at least the good ones, think a lot about risk, probably even more about risk than returns. And to state the obvious, I think the greatest risk we face is the risk of inaction. So SEDF is new to climate, but I think that we've basically said that we have no option but to proceed. One last point before I explain a little bit about why our capital is different, because we're not commercial investors. Soros Economic Development Fund, as Yamide said, is the impact investing arm of Open Society Foundations. That means that we use program-related investments. That means we can use debt or equity or guarantees, even sometimes make grants. But we really lean into risk. We're sort of quote-unquote catalytic capital. We're patient capital. We can take concessionary below-market returns. In fact, we look for those in exchange for impact. So I think it's an important distinction because we are not private equity investors in the typical sense. We're not venture capitalists. We're not investment bankers. We're not hedge fund managers. And we're not even pension funds. And I know some of the earlier sort of commercial investors we're seeing at the table are pension funds because they can take long view. Or they're insurers or reinsurers because they're actually having to pay for a lot of the catastrophic damage that we're now seeing. We're not like that. Those folks, all of them still need commercial return. But what we can do is we can use our flexible concessionary patient dollars as catalysts to de-risk. So we can get into a little bit more specifics, but I wanted to talk about a few ways. And again, we are new to some of this, but that we're at least thinking about the role of sort of quote-unquote catalytic capital in some of the blended finance stacks in particular, but also in other creative ways related to innovative finance instruments, related to community building, and a few other ways. We can get into some examples, but just briefly on this sort of crowding in capital question, because I think that when everyone talks about blended finance, they talk about sort of capital stacks and blended finance to crowd in more commercial capital. There are ways to do this in adaptation finance. They aren't easy, as all of you know, and they're not easy for a number of reasons, in part because the claim is there aren't that many or aren't enough bankable projects, or there aren't projects that will reach revenue in any sort of meaningful or sort of any commercial time horizon. What we look to do, again, either through first loss equity, first loss debt, sometimes at the table with GCF or USAID, DFC, who can come in with credit enhancement. We can come in a little bit senior. There are sort of lots of ways to structure some of this, and I'm happy to talk in a little bit more detail. I was at 3 partner events today where we're working very closely with partners in very different types of blended capital stacks to crowd in dollars for adaptation finance. So one was Acumen Hardest to Reach Fund, where a few of us were earlier today. Again, they're sort of working with GCF as a major guarantee, but then they're also commercial investors, Shinhan Bank. They're going to be folks like us coming in with more catalytic equity, and they're looking to catalyze and to scale up off-grid solar in 16 of the hardest to reach or the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And yes, this is about energy access and energy equity, but it's clearly also these are folks who don't even have electricity to begin with. So we also see it as a resilience play. On a very different end of the spectrum, we're also working with allied climate partners who are focused specifically on early project risk and using large numbers of other philanthropies. We're coming in with catalytic first loss equity. IFC is in, and those are going to be 4 different regional funds, Africa being one, starting in Southeast Asia, India, and then Latin America and the Caribbean. I won't go on to describe too many others, except that there's a whole other category of what I would describe as sort of adaptation finance or green infrastructure funds that we're also looking at. AFC is one that we're looking at, AGIA, the Alliance for Green Infrastructure, in Africa, ARM, Harith, et cetera. And I will just say on those, and we can discuss this in a little bit more detail, 2 things. One is we're thinking about sort of questions like how green really is some of this green infrastructure, the real definitional questions, sort of what do we even mean by adaptation? But more importantly, on the crowding in capital point, can we use those not just at the deal level or the facility level or the fund level, but can we use that as a proof point in the marketplace so that more capital flows, not just to that particular investment, but to a larger set? I'll come back. I've gone on too long. I'll come back. We have a whole bunch of sort of innovative finance instruments that we're also very interested in, but we'll come back to that.
Thank you, Georgia. There are several categories of people in this audience, those who understand very well, the financial jargon and familiar with the different tools, those who are just, beginning to understand and comprehend the landscape of adaptation. The point is, there's no reason. I think for 3 decades, there's been, concentration and focus on mitigation, which is important, which is the first means to adapt, reducing emission. But there's no reason for not, changing course on adaptation and take this seriously. There's actually different tools. There's no excuse for the private sector actually to engage. There's different, already you heard different tools in our arsenal to really change people's lives and to enhance livelihoods and lives. We heard the debt swap. We heard trigger-based mechanisms. We heard how from grant to less commercial interest capital we can mobilize. And the good news is that 2 days ago, 13 philanthropic organizations come together to say, you know what? We recognize that we waited too long, to get into this field. We're going to do that and to do our job, to be strategic, to get our transparency framework in place, to come back in at least 2 years, with further commitments in this field. And today there was a call from private sector to also do the same. And as Georgia said, she's been in various conversations, Dr. Dashti as well. This is, as everything is getting interlinked. So there's really a lot of hope here. And this is where I'm coming to you, Joshua, as a youth who's been co-leading the first climate justice fund for youth climate justice fund. So the youth are taking charge, to really lead a more just, future. And I wanted to really ask you how as a young leader, you you navigate all of this, and what would you like to, what you're hoping to do through this Climate Justice Fund as well?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I started my adaptation journey in 2019 or even 2018 with the Global Commission on Adaptation, and as a young person from Africa, I was looking for studies for my higher education. And no academic program made sense than to study disaster management. And the reason was that all around me, I could see really extreme weather events happening, but also the intensity of it, and it's going to get worse and worse. And yet the language in the most rooms were around fossil fuels and mitigation. And of course, the best adaptation is mitigation, but we're already late. And that is the reality. So the risk is here, and the worst of it is that in many communities, as Seyni said, adaptation is so local, but yet in many communities, we don't, or people do not understand their risk. So how many people here have seen a risk assessment that is even at the county level? Many risk assessments that we are working with now are at the national level, or most likely at the municipal level. And you never go below that. And those are the things that young people are actually, we are catalyzing young people to do with the Youth Climate Justice Fund. We opened our applications in August. We got 1,800 applicants. 70% of that were from Africa. And obviously so, because the need is so huge. Out of that 70%, majority of them were using not the word adaptation, but we're talking about everything that is about adaptation. They are saying survival is not enough, they want to thrive. They're talking about health, they're talking about food, agriculture, land use, and all the things that really will catalyze thriving for them within that continent. And we are supporting groups like that. One of the groups we'll be supporting is in Mozambique that is looking at the impact of Cyclone Idai, which was the biggest that the continent has seen, and all the other cyclones that have come afterwards. And yet, the building code standards to survive cyclones are still not being implemented effectively. And we are catalyzing young people to really hold policymakers accountable in influencing and making sure that those building codes are implemented. But even so, really helping them to raise ambition by actually constructing those buildings that are meant to resist or withstand those cyclones. So these are some of the things that the fund is really hoping to do. Moving outside of Africa, we are supporting a group called the Youth for COP30 in Brazil, and making sure that they are really able to work with young people across the Amazon region, but also indigenous communities, and working with institutions to really support institutions and how they can better work with minority groups. And that is a big gap that we currently face in many, many parts of the region, that institutions do not know how to effectively work with minority groups. It takes patience and it takes money. And we do not have enough investment that really go down to support local communities in mobilizing, in consulting, but also ensuring accountability and transparency in those consultations to go back to them and say, we consulted with you and these were the outcomes of that. And you have these resources to really build your adaptive capacity as a community. So we are really trying to use the fund, and it serves as a pool fund, and thanks to ESCWA for supporting it, to SAFE and a few others who are contributing to that. And the goal is, how do we work with grassroots youth movements who might not have the chance to be a protester or be a campaigner, but for them it's a question of whether they will become a refugee or whether they will be able to actually have a decent life. And this is a fundamental human right that they're entitled to. And how do we provide the kind of resources that such groups can actually work with on the ground? And it could be building a bridge, it could be developing the next sort of innovative agricultural technology that allow them to be able to grow food. It could be providing jobs, and those are the things that we are really investing in. And for us, what we're really hoping to see beyond what we are hoping to achieve is really calling on the bigger sector. And I was telling Yamide earlier today that it really shocks me still that it took philanthropy so long to really see that adaptation is something that really is so urgent and cannot really delay any further. And the 13 philanthropy coming together is great, but there's way more that we can actually call to join this call. Yesterday, one of the groups that we support, Green Africa Youth Organization, was the first youth organization that has been accepted as a partner to the Race to Resilience campaign. And when institutions think of young people, they don't think of them as a group that they can actually work with as an equal stakeholder, as an ally to achieve their goals. And we are beginning to see those changes with having young people really showing up, not just as a youth group that is just being put on a panel to tick that box, but really as a group that is helping institutions achieve their goals, helping to move targets forward, and really supporting such global initiatives like the Race to Resilience. So for us, it's really being able to raise that ambition and motivating everyone to go out there and really convince to really move that resources that is needed. Whether it's philanthropy, it's only 0.5% of adaptation finance coming from private sector, and that is extremely little. And when major disasters happen, private sector accumulates significant losses. Of course, they have money to buffer that out. But I think the more we can present those arguments, the more we can get money coming into the sector. And then the last point, building on what Seyni said, is around the existing money that is there. How do we make sure that that gets to the people who actually need to work with it? And that will require really continuous advocacy, but being able to really have some sort of mechanism in place that really showcase where the funding is going, who is using it, and how is it inclusive. And young people actually have that potential to showcase that. And we are really hoping to use the YCGF to catalyze that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, that was very compelling. You agree. And, you know, all of those in this panel, you know, we are supporting, we're really proud. I think, you know, we're honored. I think, you know, here what we've been doing for the past 2 years was testing those different tools, was testing those different empowerment, convening, and we still have to learn, and we need to find a way to actually showcase a little bit better beyond 1 hour, you know, all the lessons, you know, from everything that you bring. And I know that you have to go, Dr. Dashti. So I have a final, you know, question for you, and I will go for a second round before, you know, if we have time, going to the audience. You know, the question I have is, people talk a lot about that. We know how, you know, adaptation, the lack of adaptation, the lack of means to tackle loss and damage exacerbates debt. And, you know, you've been focusing, and we're working together on this debt swap, you know, initiative. And the way you, particularly in this initiative, do it is the way you bring equity and inclusion, you know, into that, and how you think it's really transforming debtors, you know, situation, and bringing more investment. I mean, I just would like you to, in your final road, to give a little bit of your picture, reflecting of that experience, and also to say what you would like, you know, to see eventually as signals moving forward.
Thank you. Let me start the strategic instruments that the initiative ESCWA is proposing, and with also partnership with OSF on that things. It's practically what we're doing. We're transforming debt, from transforming the external debt into resilient investment projects. And we're taking the liabilities of the states into assets, and we're transforming the liabilities into assets for the future. In this sense, and we're bringing the different partners on the issue, because we're looking into debt swap. The traditional debt swap is a project-oriented. You have a project, you do the debt swap on it. What we're thinking is not a project, it's a program. So we're scaling up the issue. It's a program on various climate resilient projects. We're bringing them into the table. So we have scalability. We have a long term. We're putting this scalability project until 2030. The second thing is the matrix, which is very important, so that the creditors ensure that the swapping funds are going to sustainable projects through the matrix and the KPIs that we're generating. And by doing this generation of a KPIs matrix, okay, what are these matrices? These are SDG goals that are indicators for these matrices. So what we're doing is we're doing these climate resilient projects to also accelerate not also the Paris Agreement, but also accelerate the implementation of the SDGs on these projects, whether it was SDG 1, reducing poverty, whether it's creating job, whether it was women empowerment, whether when we're talking about SDG 6 and water, or SDG 7 and SDG 13, plus SDG 17, which is the partnership. In this case, there is a KPI matrix that is addressing also. So you're having a win-win situation. These projects, creditors are fulfilling their obligations through sustainable projects. Debtors are obligated also to achieve these resilient and investing in climate actions, plus accelerating the achieving of SDGs. In partnership, when having this debt swap, we're trying to bring the philanthropy, the other donors, community, to the SDG to be also chipping in, because now we have a government commitment on these climate resilient projects. So you accelerate the funding availability by bringing the other partners, the donor community, into these projects also to fulfill and accelerate the project. And now also with OSF, also we're bringing also the civil societies, the people, because these projects are impacting people. So you need them also to be aware. Financing civil societies are not so much, they work much more on issues of social issues to improve their economic issues. Now we're bringing them also to understand that issues that the country is facing, because at the end of the day, they hold the burden of these debts and the debt servicing. So we're engaging them of understanding all these debt instruments and engaging them on the project selection. We're talking about community-based adaptation projects to the local community. The importance is these projects, and we're targeting local community, poor areas, also that we ensure that the projects are there, because one of our KPI matrices is reduction of poverty, addressing SDG 1, so it becomes a local community. And this is where we're going and moving forward by building capacity, innovative approach on that things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm not going to even try to summarize what what you said. I think we heard a lot, is debt swapped, really working. It doesn't, it's not a size fits all. It's, there's a lot of discussions about how effective it is. But what this project is doing is taking it further, testing it with different KPIs, linking it to the SDGs a little bit more, and we're learning by doing. And if you have any questions, I think you know who to go to, and we do have also some colleagues here, have made this possible, and I know you have to go, so thank you so much.
I have to apologize. My apologies.
And I would like to go to dig a little bit more also into this trigger-based mechanism kind of aspect with Sarah Jane, with the experience of the V20. And I remember back in COP26, we took the risk of, having a pledge, of 1 million to the loss and damage, and to kind of create a momentum within the negotiations. And that 1 million actually went to the V20, half of it to the V20, to really help and test how to channel that at community level, right? And and I think you've been looking, and you're still looking at how to pilot it and to test it, to really create the right social protection ultimately, and to give choice to the communities. Because yes, insurance mechanism, trigger-based, people feel sometimes that, that's not the panacea, it does not work. But at the end of the day, it's about providing choices, for allowing communities to move along in dignity. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Yamide. So when the V20 set off with the loss and damage funding program, this was, I think, a year ago is when, more than a year ago, is when the Open Societies Foundation supported it, but that the concept of it was quite well before, and this is in anticipation of the Loss and Damage Fund. Because, as we know, subnational level communities don't have direct access to climate finance. It's really challenging. And so how do we deliver the multilateral system, or bring the multilateral system down to the community level? Because that's the scale, and then obviously the projects and programs get smaller as we go. So the loss and damage funding program then decided to work with a group that has good national footprint and local partners. And so in this case, to make it simpler for communities, there were 4, let's say, broad expenditure lines and sub-expenditure lines. And one is community infrastructure, so that includes community hospitals, schools, could even be, their power system. For livelihood assets, it includes private houses, livelihood opportunities that they've lost as a result of climate impact. So it could be cattle, it could be harvest, it could be anything relating to their livelihood. The third is coral reef restoration. A lot of the small island states, the atoll states, have these coral reefs that need to be protected. They also act as a buffer And then, of course, the fourth component, adaptation, which at the time was challenging to include because there was this big push to ensure that we don't encroach on each space, on the adaptation space or the loss and damage space. But in practical terms, okay, so let's take the example of someone's livelihood opportunity. As a result of a flood, they've now lost all their chicken. Okay. And after the flood, they would need financing to replace the asset, right? But we know that if they do this again, it's going to have the same impact. Like they're going to lose it again. It's just a matter of when. So in the case of Bangladesh, as an example, I think Dr. Salim also had this in one of his books some years ago. The farmers shifted to having ducks. Why? Because when it floods, they're better off. So it's simple, but it's the replacement part is loss and damage, and then diversification is adaptation. You can't have one without the other, and it shouldn't be a trade-off. It enables more resilience. So anyway, that's a very simplified way of looking at this, but I wanted to share that because that's what we're doing in the Loss and Damage Funding Program. So we're working across 3 countries, Bangladesh, Kenya, and Malawi. In Bangladesh, it's to do with floods, and the beneficiaries are around 1,200 in a village, a large village for the smaller countries, but Bangladesh is a big population. And then in Kenya, it's 2,000 people dealing with drought, and then in Malawi, it's also flood, and that's about 1,000 people. So we're working on the loss and damage component with support from philanthropy, Open Societies Foundation, and then now the question is, where's the adaptation funds going to come from? So we're partnering with the Global Environment Facility to fund the adaptation component, and the question is now, can we blend these two together and report at the portfolio level? So that way, we have less M&E costs, but at the same time, you're giving communities the flexibility to decide whether they're going to, turn into fisher folk or decide that they're going to go into duck rearing. So, there are these options that we want to, or these lessons that we want to share from this program, so that as the community here goes into the loss and damage fund, like mechanics, some of this can be taken into account to give countries more agency and opportunity to have both loss and damage and adaptation funds.
Thank you very much. I think this was a great example to make it really tangible on how adaptation and loss and damage works hand in hand. This is why, for 2 years we were looking at those 2 issues together, and this is one of the examples. And it's not the only, what you have, who you have on the table are not our only grantees. I see our colleague, Amjad from Arena, we've just also who just launched an Empowering Lives and Livelihood initiative that we're supporting also, and that hopefully with our 1 million will trigger another 1 billion, from with the private sector and other donors. But I just wanted to come back again. Seyni, with the equity and inclusivity, dimension of what you do with the African Adaptation Initiative. And we don't have a lot of time, we still have, 3 last, comments. So how do you think we can really ensure the distribution and resources, for the relief, the recovery, through, what you're doing, or just the empowerment, and, maybe, I don't know if the Ecoverse project, can be used to highlight that, but the promotion of local ownership, that you've been tested, and to really lead to the strategies and scale up, at regional level.
Again, repeating myself, I think it's extremely important to engage local stakeholders. And I'll give you a few examples, and I'm happy that Joshua talked about it. For the last 2 or 3 years, African civil society, like 5,000 of them, and every day there's a new organization. I've been challenging them to say, okay, you've been advocating for so long, but there are organizations within whose job actually is to work, not just to advocate it, but to work at the local level. So we finalized the design of a small grant fund I'm happy that at the global level this has been done. But to say, let's channel resources to that level, and I'm talking about projects from like $500, $1,000, a solar water pump in a woman cooperative on 2 acres will transform their lives. And that's maybe $5,000 max. So, but you need, again, you and I won't be able, even I, as a Pan-African organization, will not be able to do that. The only way to have that granularity or capillarity is to empower, so that's localization, aggregation. So that's on SME is the same thing. We're building a blending facility, tackling food insecurity on the continent by trying to identify the next African Tesla or Microsoft. So we want to identify those innovative SMEs who 10, 20 years from now will sort of solve the food crisis on the continent. 50 years, I like to say that the first word I learned in French growing in the Sahel was food security. And that's already a few decades ago. And 40 years or so after that, plus a few hundred billion spent, we're more food insecure. So the approach we want to say is, okay, we're betting on the young innovators across the food value chain and investing in them. I'm sure that if we were only spending $1 billion in some of those companies, I mean, the level of innovation in that space is out of this world. Again, empower them. Subnationals. Even the national entities are having a difficulty accessing climate finance. Subnationals, okay, what are we doing? We're working with them, the whole 16,000 subnationals on the continent, to set up, well, they wanted a bank. I said, okay, well, let's start maybe with just an SPV, a fund. So we're starting a fund, which is going to be anchored at a regional development bank, and then so that they have their own vehicle, empower everyone, so that, and that is, it's very easy. You want to be inclusive? Just be inclusive. Why do we talk about that and then for the longest, it's not happening? Now it's happening because we're Africans. I have no other vested interest than strengthening the continent. I have no other interest than, and strengthening subnationals, strengthening civil society, strengthening SMEs, strengthening everyone. And deploying all that. We can have a long conversation on finance. Absolutely. The Ecoverse program that you talk about, which is about creating resilient rural communities. We have a whole, so at the end, we're creating a new asset class, but we're starting with philanthropy, then we're blending with GCF, which is a bit more concessional, then we're bringing, your type of equity, first loss tranche, then we're going to green bonds, and then it's a whole new asset class, and then pension funds can come in. So we're also using that to close the gap. So the order of magnitude gap, the way we close that is through very serious financial engineering in terms of de-risking and securitization. So yeah, unfortunately, one of the few who can talk about.
So you see, you really have to go and to speak to him again, and also Sandra Freitas, who is the associate, also working so much on this engineering, and it's a good segue to you, Georgia, on how the private sector, if you had just a couple of words on how the private sector can take into account all that local knowledge, to take it to the next level. Ultimately, everything that I hear, I'm so glad. I think when at COP27 we committed to support AI, there's been a matching from a private sector, from a bank, Société Générale, to match the same level of our grant. And then you had also, there we go. Okay, so it's increasing. It's not even finishing. So that's those bets and those examples hopefully will inspire more organization. And I see actually one of those philanthropy that was in the trench in supporting AI was there. The Gates Foundation as well. But there's more. But at the end of the day, Georgia, how to take effectively those local knowledge before I give the final word to also Joshua.
So I think what we've heard today are some really compelling examples of what I would say are the following. One, whether it's debt for nature swaps or trigger-based mechanisms on loss and damage or insurance, whatever they are, good investments impact investments or other aren't found. You don't find them and you say, that's what I'm going to do. They're made and they're created, and it takes a whole bunch of folks to create them. And I sometimes think of, I think it was Andy Grove, who was the founder of Intel, who had all these really smart engineers in his company, and he'd say, okay, guys, it's great, keep working really hard, because the smartest people in the world and the best ideas in the world are not in our company, like by definition, right? And I guess as I think about local knowledge, local empowerment, like being proximate to real issues on the ground and the decisions of what actually a project should look like what those needs are, almost by definition means that, that local meaningful input isn't just socially responsible, it's a strategic imperative. That's what makes the investments really sustainable, that's what makes them last, that's what's gonna make them viable. And so to the extent that investors understand we may have capital or may have a piece of the capital, right, but actually the design, the implementation, the long-term management has to be local.
Thank you very much, Joshua. We are going into, we are having this global stock-taking exercise where we are ready to be, and we expect a response that will, be judged in the moment of truth 2 years, in Brazil, for the COP, where after this global stocktake, all countries, will need to submit, plans that really show real ambition, enhance progress and closing the gap. That also includes, the role of local authorities, demonstrate, how they took into account the local knowledge and bring private sector. What's your hope? What would you like, looking at the 2 years ahead, what would you like to say about this?
Yeah, I think 2 years from now, I would expect to really see, increase in capital and increase in funding, but also that inclusivity and the equity angle of finance. The reality is that, we always can talk about the 100 billions and trillions of money that is needed, but it takes sometimes $1,000 to change the whole situation for someone. And the billions and the trillions are needed, and it closes a certain gap. But I think that being able to create different finance, moving money in different ways that allow for different stakeholders to access money is the most critical thing that is really needed. And that is why we set up the YCJF. It's really to be able to give that unrestricted, flexible core funding to local groups so they can build the organizational development, they can really strengthen themselves, and they can be able to do the minimum that is required for them to be able to exist and thrive, while the national government and the multilateral entities really play with the big monies. And before that filters from, international to national to subnational to municipality to county to then a local community, small community somewhere. So I think that in 2 years from now, if we can really have different financing mechanisms that really allow equal access, and when I say equal access, yes, the 100 and the 5,000, the 10,000 are good, but we need to be able to give both to local communities. We use their data, we use information, we use their stories, and yet it's always the peanuts that comes to young people, that come to children, that come to really indigenous communities, that come to communities on the ground. And I think being able to give bold and unrestricted and flexible is super essential. So those are the things I really expect to see when it comes to adaptation finance.
Thank you. Look, I hope you enjoyed, this conversation. We don't have time to go. We only had an hour. I wish we could stay more. But I would like you to give a round of applause to this panel. And I think one of the key words is really diversification. What I hope you had a hint today is the richness of the type of tools. There's a lot of tools available that can really make a difference. So it's about the numbers, mobilizing more. It's about how to trickle it down to where it needs to be. And there's different ways to do that. We gave you a glimpse of what it could be. And we're looking forward to working with all of you to actually even expand, the horizons of those approaches to really get to where we need to be. And, there's a quote, from William Barclay, saying that endurance is not the ability to bear a hard thing. Yes, we know it's hard, but to turn it into glory. And I really hope that over the next 8 days of this COP, we're going to really turn, some of those hard conversations into something really meaningful that really provide a little bit of a more glorious future. And we're in need of this, especially for the generation to come. But thank you, and looking forward to continuing working with you. Thank you.